Welcome back to Autism Live on this last show of the last day of of this year. We are so excited because last week a conversation was started with Bonnie Yates where she was talking about really important information having to do with mandated reporters, and we wanted to make sure we finished that conversation. So Bonnie is joining us right now from Hirji and Chow. Thank you so much for being with us, Bonnie. Really quick disclosure and some information about Hirji and Chow.
Yeah, Hirji and Chow LLP is a disability and disability discrimination law firm in Culver City. We can be reached 310-391-0330 if you have special ed questions within the state of California, which is how I usually answer the questions because I'm licensed in California. If you're in another state, you need to find an attorney in your own state, which you can do at www.copaa.net. And these answers that I'm giving, or these things that we're discussing, are general. They're not specific to your family situation. So if you have specific questions, there's lots of ways to get them answered competently, and you should avail yourself of that information. But last week we talked about mandated reporters, which is a category of person in California that's required to report child sexual abuse. And we talked about what kind of training school personnel get in mandated reporting and observations of child abuse, because school personnel are often on the front lines of kids, and in some weeks, in fact, might spend more time with kids than people's own parents. So we talked about some of the red flags, and now I'm moving on to reporting. What gets reported and by whom and why. So should I just jump in?
Absolutely. Jump away.
Okay, so in addition to overt abuse, physical or psychological, there's a requirement that mandated reporters report neglect. So some examples of neglect would be negligent treatment or maltreatment, leaving a young person in a car, depriving them of food or clothing or bathroom or shelter or needed medication. There are other forms of neglect that include ignoring a child, not enrolling a child in school, some red flags for neglect or dirty clothing, poor hygiene, severe dental problems, and so on. There may be an observation of the home environment as dangerous, where medications or cleaning supplies are within reach, guns or weapons not secured in the home being dirty with trash or insects or rotted food or animal waste around, or choking hazards. So these would all be things that the mandated reporter is making note of and is expected to address with a report. Obviously, any willful harming of a child or unjustifiable physical pain or mental suffering is covered under Penal Code 11165.3. And then there's this whole area of emotional abuse, which is a real thing, but it's going to be harder to definitively establish than physical abuse. But emotional abuse impairs a child's emotional and physical development, and they give some examples. You could have constant criticism, threats, rejection, intimidation, humiliation, withholding love and support, isolating a child, scapegoating a child, belittling a child, using cruel words. Sorry, the phone should be turned off. What's that gonna do? Okay, sorry about that. Using cruel words, etc. And then there are behavioral factors to look at. Does the person manifest an unusual degree of anxiety, depression, self-abuse, for example, cutting, suicidal threats or actions, low self-esteem, clingy or hostile behavior, unsafe behavior, or a significant change in behavior. So then we get into what we call the who, the how, the when, the to whom, confidentiality versus immunity, and liability. And that's all contained within Penal Code 11165.7, where they define, what a reasonable suspicion is and so forth. So you always have to report, as I said, to either Child Protective Services or local law enforcement. We had a case where we actually represented some of the behaviorists who were in a classroom where they saw an aide abusing another student, and they reported it, they thought, correctly to the school principal, but they never reported it to law enforcement, and actually they were the subject of an investigation for failure to report properly. You're required to report by phone because it's the fastest, and then within 36 hours follow up with a writing. There's actually a specific Department of Justice form you're supposed to use. It's criminally wrong as well as civilly wrong if you inhibit another person from making a report. And I wrote this down, I put a star next to it because I thought it really pertained to our case. Although less common, school personnel may become aware that a colleague has done something that may be considered abuse or neglectful. Denial is a common response, especially when a staff member is one who is well liked and respected. So it's important to remember that school personnel must report known or suspected abuse no matter who the suspected abuser is. And once that happens, there's going to be a DCFS investigation. They will interview all the involved or potentially involved parties. And they have a comment here, Shannon, that I think relates to what you were saying you were a little concerned about before. Parents or others who mistreat children are beset by problems that overwhelm them. Many report poor treatment by their own parents and unhappy childhoods. They may not be able to handle the normal stress of raising children without help. The social worker should offer counseling, referrals to self-help, assistance in obtaining medical care, emergency shelter, transportation, or child care, and should promote unification, family reunification wherever possible. So you can see there's a role for the social worker beyond just investigating. It's actually, figuring out kind of like a crisis management plan for the family that will hopefully allow everybody to stay together in a healthy way in the home. School personnel are to share school records, notwithstanding FERPA, the federal education and privacy law. You still have to provide school records if there's a law enforcement or DCFS investigation. And not only do they have to share those records, but they are required to keep written documentation of all their contacts, so that if the case is adjudicated and the mandated reporter has to testify, which can happen, they have a good record. Now, failure to report for a teacher may result in the loss in California of a license or a credential. Reporting creates a paper trail that helps develop a case. The Department of Justice has a database that it maintains, the Child Abuse Central Index. So there's also a place that these things go for, future reference. And then they talk about how, some of the challenges for school personnel are, you can't use corporal punishment, but what do you do if you have a behavioral child? What constitutes appropriate physical touching? And then this is sort of where I get into some statistics from them. Of 600,000 children, the research suggests that 10% of 6 million students in California, so in other words, 600,000, will experience some kind of abuse by school personnel. That's 10%. That's very,
horrifying.
Very low. It is. And that's part of the reason we're talking about this. So, in terms of biases, contrary to what some people may believe, perpetrators are rarely strangers and do not fit a particular profile or stereotype. They're often well-liked members of the community and look like everyone else. They may cultivate a public self in an effort to be likable and make a positive impression, establishing trust with those around them. Thus, if an if an accusation arises, friends and colleagues may come to their defense. Perpetrators of child sexual abuse often premeditate their offenses and choose professions that bring them into contact with children, which we all know. And in public school situations, there's kind of a closeness and a camaraderie within the faculty and the trenches together that results in people not believing that another adult in the community has committed the abuse, even in some cases after the accused person confesses. So there's this institutional bias against reporting that is to some extent subconscious and occurring without people really realizing that. And that's why I'm talking about this. There are some recommendations made by this woman, Cheryl Shakeshaft, who's referenced in the training. And she said, in terms of making kids safe, you don't ever have covered windows. You don't put kids in, if you have any locking classrooms, they're checked at the end of the day. And after school activities are done in a public place. School personnel are not to be alone with the student, take a student alone in their car, or hang out and socialize with students. That's really not appropriate. So you have to have unambiguous consequences and clear policies, a clear definition for zero tolerance, and everyone within the community that's a mandated reporter is responsible for identifying and reporting. With the notion in mind that by increasing awareness, you're going to be protecting more children. They note that, as we've discussed, it's not appropriate for, let's say, a school principal to conduct an internal investigation. It has to be conducted by outside personnel. Now, here's our stuff. Children with disabilities are more likely to be victims of abuse. They are 1.7 times more likely to be abused or maltreated. So children with disabilities have, certain features or characteristics that they struggle with that makes them more vulnerable. For example, children that are behaviorally challenging children are going to be at higher risk for abuse if they're being cared for by adults that aren't trained in, positive behavior interventions and so on. Caregivers may have unrealistic expectations for disabled kids and become frustrated. Crucial that those caring for children with behavioral disorders are educated about the particular child's needs and limitations. So you can see this has a lot of import for our community, where our kids are oftentimes, being worked with adults in a professional capacity. Because children with disabilities are more likely to be exposed to multiple caregivers, both inside and outside the family, they are also exposed to more potentially abusive situations. They are more used to being touched by adults. They're less aware of danger. They're exposed to multiple caregivers. They can't distinguish abuse from, it's harder to distinguish abuse from intellectual disability. So if a child is shutting down, what does that mean? They're taught to be compliant, they're isolated and lack social support, and they're rarely educated about abuse prevention. So in wrapping up here, treatment of children with disabilities is often identified through observation of physical signs or verbal disclosure by the child. In the absence of verbal disclosure of direct observations, behavioral indicators may alert school personnel to suspect abuse. Though some behavior may be a result of the child's disability, changes in the child's behavior should serve as a warning signal to look further. It is important to know how a child usually functions so you will be aware of behavioral changes that could be caused by abuse or neglect. Additionally, disability symptoms may be the result of child mistreatment, so we're told to err on the side of caution.
Okay, it's all a little overwhelming, and it isn't the easiest thing in the world to hear, but I think it's so important that we talk about these safeguards for all of our kids. It's absolutely unthinkable, except that clearly if it's happening to 10% of kids and our kids are more likely, it's staggering to think.
It is, but you see this if you do what I do, you see situations in which adults are mistreating kids. I had another situation in Utah where I tried to report to school and I couldn't get anybody in the entire state to investigate it. So then I reported it to the California Department of Education, and they've sat on it for the last 2 years, and they've conducted no investigation. So what I came to realize is, not all adults who mistreat kids are bad people per se. Some of them are people that are not trained to work with kids with disabilities, and if they get a really behavioral kid, they get frustrated.
Yeah.
And so, in addition to the safeguards in terms of like the campus and, always having children with adults in groups, I mean, we have to give our behavioral people more training. We can't have untrained aides working with kids with autism because they will get frustrated. It's a really, really tricky disorder to manage behaviorally.
Absolutely.
So,
well, this is a song we sing on Autism Live a lot. I'm all about anyone who's working with kids in the education system having training for knowing what to do about behavior, whether it's behavior having to do with autism or behavior having to do with behavior. There are lots of reasons why people have behavior management problems, and adequate training just isn't a part of what's happening. I am frustrated that I think that in the current education hierarchy, I don't see the attention being paid to that. I think there's much more attention towards farming kids off to other schools and dismantling the public education system. So here at Autism Live, we've started something called Autism in the Classroom, and we're hoping to bring more training to teachers and educators and paras who are like, well, if the school's not going to give it to me, where am I going to get it? And we can provide it free of charge. So we're trying to do that as a way, as a stopgap measure, because I had hoped that that was going to happen on a federal level, and I don't see it.
I don't either.
Unfortunately.
Anyway, California, we do have, fairly strong legal protections. So, there they are. It's in the penal code. It's a crime.
And thank you for sharing it with us, Bonnie. I think it's, it's a great way to end the year legally, to say, okay, here's what we now know, so we know what to do if we see something happening, and we know what's at stake. So it's incredible, and I thank you always. I said this last week, but I hope, I'm glad that we got to finish this conversation. I hope 2018 is a wonderful, happy, peaceful, joyous, and abundant year for you, and healthy.
And that's what I was just going to say to you, and healthy for you.
Yes.
Okay. Good.
Let's make all that happen.
Talk to you soon, Shannon.
And we'll see you in 2018.
Onward.
Give my love to your family.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Shannon.
That was the fabulous Bonnie Yates, wonderful special education attorney. She's with Hear Ji and Chow. If you need special education services locally here in Los Angeles or in the California area, please reach out to Hear Ji and Chow, and you can talk to Bonnie yourself. Thank you so much. We're going to take a break, and then we're going to be back with more Autism Live. Stick with us.